Welcome to Psychedelics and Brain Health from Promise to Practice. I'm Mark Resnick, and I'm as of last week, the immediate past chair of the American Brain Coalition. And I wanted to tell you what the American Brain Coalition is, and that is a group of it's a coalition of advocacy groups for all broken brains. It's the docs, the psychologists, psychiatrists, and neurologists, and it's the several neuroscience groups, including our co-sponsor for today, the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, which is a professional organization made up of psychiatrists and neuroscientists who study drugs in the brain. We are, and so together, we're pleased to co-host today's educational webinar. I should mention you, I am a neuroscientist and a professor of physiology and psychiatry at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. So over the past few years, psychedelic compounds once were confined to recreational or religious practice and the margins of medicine. But they've reemerged in both serious scientific and clinical discussions and experiments, and they're spurred on by a lot of research involving the neuroscience of psychedelics. And we're seeing remarkable therapeutic potential in depression, PTSD, addiction, end-of-life trauma, distress, and several compounds are now in phase 3 clinical trials and moving closer to possible, hopefully, FDA approval. But with this momentum, some complex questions arise. And how do we translate the findings from scientific studies, many lacking an appropriate control for obvious reasons, and how do we translate them into clinical benefit, and how do we ensure patient safety, ethical use of these compounds, and most importantly, equitable access to treatment? And how do we manage public enthusiasm with scientific responsibility? So today's conversation brings together leaders across science, clinical care, regulation, and advocacy to help us navigate this transformative and challenging moment. To begin with, I'd like to start with lived experience, and it's a pleasure to introduce Marcus Capone. Marcus is a veteran Navy SEAL who retired from active duty in 2013 after 13 years of special ops service. He received numerous awards for valor throughout his 6 combat tours with SEAL Team 6, the nation's premier counterterrorism unit. And he and Amber Capone have founded VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, and they're dedicated to expanding safe access to psychedelic-assisted therapy for veterans struggling with their own mental health. Last month, the film In Waves and War premiered on Netflix, and this really powerful film documented the tormented lives of some of these veterans and the salvation brought through psychedelics. And now Marcus will tell us his own story.
Yeah, Mark, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me on and being here, and thank you for the introduction. So a little about me. I promised Mark, asked me yesterday, how long can I go? He said, as long as you want. I said, well, I'll try to keep this under 10 minutes. I'll do my best. But I do want to, definitely there's some things I want to hit just to show the progress of what life was like before I feel like my life was turned around through psychedelic treatment. So a little about me. And again, hi everyone, Dr. Farchione, Dr. Nutt, Dr. Volkow, really good to see you on this panel, really humbled to be on this panel with you all. So I do not have MD or PhD after my name. I do have MBA, but it's exciting to be here. So I am, as Mark mentioned, co-founder, chairman of VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, where we're really focused on psychedelic assisted therapy. When I went to the employee benefit space, they don't like that term, so we use alternative treatments and other things. But the mission with my charity is to end veteran suicide. I'm also the founder and CEO of TAR Mind, which I was just talking about, where there it's very exciting what we're doing and really gaining ground. We're expanding access to evidence-based care for those with treatment-resistant mental health conditions. And we're doing that through advanced data work with employer benefit plans and healthcare systems. And that's getting extremely busy. There individuals are starting to learn what treatment-resistant mental health is, where they didn't before. Finally, what's on the, I guess on the docker here, I am a veteran Navy SEAL. I was a breacher, which means I was an explosive expert, multiple combat tours since 9/11, and I did retire in 2013, as Mark mentioned. More importantly, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a friend of many. And I'm a person whose life and family were almost lost to invisible injuries. I'm here because of a psychedelic intervention outside the US, and it really changed the trajectory of everything I'm doing today, and I think potentially where this field has been and where it's going. As you can imagine, my transition home, I wouldn't consider it a victory lap. It was actually quite a struggle for me. Years of, you've heard this before, depression, anger, cognitive decline, anxiety. I would end up in the emergency room with anxiety attacks. Think I was having a heart attack. And really just, relational fallout with my wife, my children, my mom and dad. I was diagnosed with all the labels, TBI, PTSD, I had blast exposure, I had sleep and hormone issues. I was drinking heavily and by myself, which is never good. And I was, I was on the standard care of treatment. So I tried traditional medications, SNRIs, SSRIs, talk therapy, other interventions that I believe you are aware of. They helped a little. I don't think they they moved the needle enough, and they were short-lived for me. 2017, I felt like I was running out of options. I was really contemplating whether I should be here or not. But I was 100% convinced that my family would be better off without me in the picture. And that was a trying time. I'm obviously not alone here. Why I'm talking, veterans are still dying by suicide every day, despite doing quote unquote everything right within the system. We really need to change that. And so how did I find this path? Lucky for me, my wife, Amber, who's the co-founder of Vets, she's the CEO. She searched desperately. She actually reached out to almost every brain expert in the US for about a year about what she saw in me after a treatment I went through called Ibogaine. Ironically or fortunately, Dr. Nolan Williams from Stanford was the only one that would listen, just because he had a history around Ibogaine. He knew about it for almost 15 years. He's the only one who took us seriously, and he passed recently, and so we're going to continue the work that we're doing. For me, it was quite simple. We feel like we've looked into everything. I visited several brain centers, and really a teammate shared his experience about the decision to pursue really a vetted supervised Ibogaine retreat outside the U.S. And it was introduced to us in mid 2017. I committed towards the end of 2017 with a lot of hesitation. Why I say hesitation? This was so foreign to me. I grew up in New York. I was an all-American athlete. I went to Catholic school. I never did any drugs, and so this was really far outside my comfort zone. But the more I did the research, and I want to emphasize that the treatment for me was a real medical treatment. It wasn't a fly-by-night, recreational use of a drug or a church or some other facilitated, shamanistic treatment by a so-called expert. I believe those are extremely dangerous. I think I'll set this renaissance back. We need to do this correctly. We need to do it now. And we're a big believer in that. That's why we've done so well with vets. This retreat that I went to had a full medical screening. I did blood work, I did urinalysis, I did EKG. My heart was monitored the whole time. There was a real clinical oversight. This wasn't a casual treatment. What I got out of the experience was renewed clarity. It was relief. It was extreme relief from relentless mental noise. I had the ability to feel again. I had the ability to be present with my family again. I said to Amber, this is exactly what the guys need. We had a real uptick in suicides during that time, and they were searching like I was. And this became really my internal takeaway and what I've been doing for the past 8 years now. I'd love to connect my experience to the emerging science, and I think that's what the experts here on the panel are going to do today, and I'm excited about that. But we need to acknowledge that there are rigorous trials now happening. They're showing psychedelics such as MDMA or psilocybin, soon ibogaine, can produce really large, durable reductions in PTSD and depression and symptoms of traumatic brain injury for many, including veterans, of course. It's my focus with our charity. And I think, it underscores that my story is just a data point inside a much bigger, expanding evidence base. So, for believers or non-believers and skeptics, I'd like to go into that a little bit. I got off my medication that I was on for 7 years, right before my treatment. I've never had to go back on any of them now. That's 8 years since. Since then, my wife and I founded Vets, really started a way to help teammates, as this has now grown into a multinational nonprofit supporting thousands of special operations veterans and spouses with access, with preparation, and with aftercare for psychedelic therapy. Some of the milestones, and I believe it's important to show again the progress of where I was, which was really, really struggling, to where we are today post-treatment. First, I don't drink anymore. Not a sip. It's bad for you, and it slowed me down, and I want to be sharp. We have funded now over 1,200 veterans, primarily from U.S. Special Operations Forces, but now we're flying individuals over from Denmark, Sweden, the U.K., places like the Ukraine and Israel and Australia are knocking on our door regularly, and we're trying to figure out how to work across the globe. It's difficult. Access, as you know, is difficult. Again, some milestones. I do believe it's important. We've raised over $20 million directly into Vets to support these treatments, research, advocacy work. We've raised over $45 million into 2 separate entities directly tied to this mission. And we've unlocked over $118 million in public and private funding for additional research. This year, our charity was given a 100% rating by Charity Navigator, which is the gold standard. We were recognized as the top 4 charities out of 225,000 nationwide. I owe much of that to my wife, Amber, who's the CEO. We've led historic legislative victories in Texas, the Douglas Mike Day Act, federally, money released from the NDAA. We passed the bill with Governor Newsom in California, 2241, and then we had the historic Texas victory where we unlocked $100 million for ibogaine research. So all this stuff is happened post-treatment. So however you want to decide whether these things work or not, I'm just telling you everything that's happened post-treatment. What we've seen at scale, not disclosing specific individuals, but we're seeing patterns, right? We're seeing including the data from Stanford's profound ibogaine study, reductions in PTSD and depression and suicidality and substance use. Many of these individuals with failed multiple treatments and have had attempted suicide multiple times. So, we have to note that there are risks. These experiences are or can be extremely difficult. The need for screening, integration, and guardrails is a must. There's not even a question about that. It's not a silver bullet also for many. We need to take this seriously and we need to do it right. Again, my biased opinion, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a PhD or MD. I have my MBA from SC, but I do believe that we're seeing the brain's ability of neuroplasticity. We're not seeing it anywhere comparable to what I think we're seeing here and so quickly. And so I want to now transition this over to the panel, and I want to frame this first question for the audience. Really, my family, it sits at the intersection of desperation, innovation, and now rapidly evolving science. And the question really is, how do we move from stories like mine to safe, equitable, evidence-based access inside the system? So inside the system, including insurance coverage and everything else, which is going to be challenging, which I'm working on, but it's still going to be extremely challenging. So I think the 3 individuals today: science, regulation, safety through the FDA, and then public policy and addiction. In science, leading researchers are clarifying how psychedelic-assisted therapy may impact brain circuitry, plasticity, memory, and trauma processing. on the regulation safety side, and the FDA's perspective is essential in turning powerful compounds into safe, standardized medicines at scale. That's important. And then on the policy side, policy, public health, and addiction, NIDA's role in understanding both the therapeutic potential and misuse risk, and in building those guardrails for implementation, which I mentioned has to happen. So my hope is that this conversation moves us beyond stigma and hype into serious coordinated action. The evidence, ethics, and lived experience like mine and many others shape how these tools are brought into brain health care. And so thank you again, Mark and the team, for acknowledging that those struggling now, and we invite listeners, really to hold both the promise and the responsibility of this moment. So excited to hear the panel and hopefully answer some questions afterwards. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Marcus. It is so important that we hear from those people who we're hoping our science will ultimately benefit. So with that, what we're going to do is each of us are going to introduce ourselves, and then we're going to, for a minute or so, tell us what you're doing and how it relates to the subject matter of today. And it's okay to engage in puffery, especially Harriet and David. That's just fine. Nora Volkow, who is director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has been called to a command performance, but she will be here in about 15 minutes. Okay, so Harriet, why don't we start with you?
All right. Thank you for inviting me to join you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to, before I introduce myself, I just want to say to Marcus, your story is very moving, and I see you as a pioneer yourself. And your work as an advocate is making a huge contribution that we in the scientific and medical world, it's kind of parallel to what we do. And you have an audience that we don't have. So people are listening to you that are normally outside of our scope in the medical and psychiatric world. So what you're doing is terrific. And then in addition, the fundraising that you do is much needed right now while the public funding catches up with the field. So I just wanted to acknowledge, thank you for what you do. Very courageous.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And use me as a voice. And like I said, I don't want to allow the stories to get ahead of the science. So I want to go in parallel tracks here. But sometimes
Terrific.
we need to be over the tips of our skis when we're doing some of these in circles. So
Be careful, be careful. Okay. My name's Harriet DeWitt. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago. And I study effects of drugs in healthy human volunteers. So we administer psychoactive drugs of all kinds to healthy volunteers and ask them how the drugs make them feel, look at how the drugs make them behave, and how the drugs affect their brain function. And most recently, I've done some studies using MDMA and then also very low doses of LSD. So I haven't done any high doses of psychedelic drugs, and I'll leave that to Dr. Nutt to describe. The very low doses are interesting. It's a phenomenon that's referred to as microdosing. And I think what got me interested in the area is that so many people report doing it. They report using these very low doses, usually of LSD, over an extended period of time, every 3 or 4 days. And they report feeling better on a whole wide range of variables. So better mood, better cognition, better relationships, a whole wide range of things. But it's been difficult to test the reliability of those reports under controlled conditions. So the reports come from people who have very strong expectations that the drug is going to make them feel better. And it's hard for us to separate out the expectations from the pharmacological effects of the drug. So that's where I come in. I can give the drug under blinded conditions where the people don't know whether they're getting the drug or a placebo. And so we and a few other laboratories have been looking at effects of either single doses of low doses of LSD or repeated doses of LSD. And I have to just summarize it and say, until now, it isn't very the support, the evidence for the beneficial effects of these low doses, repeated low doses, has been limited. It seems that the drug makes people feel better, a little more energetic, a little bit more aroused on the first occasions that they take it, but we haven't seen any long-lasting beneficial effects. Now, these are studies that are done in healthy volunteers. And so the question then is, what about what about giving these low doses in people who have some psychiatric problems? And so we actually have recently looked at low doses of LSD in people with symptoms of depression. And there we actually see people reporting a little bit of improvement in feelings of well-being. We have to extend this to people really who have treatment-resistant depression or who meet diagnostic criteria. But there's some evidence that maybe the problem is that we're not looking at symptomatic people, we're looking at healthy volunteers. So I would say we keep an open mind at this point. There might still be some neural changes that are related to these low doses, and they may have some benefit in the long term in the psychiatric world. So I'm just speaking about my personal lab experience with these drugs. So microdosing has potential, but it has yet to be demonstrated who it works best in. So Mark, do you want to expand on that, or do you want to just go on to David Nutt and get
I want to go to David, and then we'll come back because I think this
That
is a
sounds
very
good.
important point which people are going to be very interested in.
All right.
I do want to make a comment before I introduce David that the term treatment-resistant depression is one that is really troubling to me because, in a sense, what happens is after a patient doesn't respond to 4 different drug trials, they're termed treatment-resistant as if it's their fault, and it's not their fault. And after those 4 trials, neither the doc nor the patient really expects anything is going to work. And with that, someone who has worked on this extensively, in fact, really the pioneer for psilocybin and depression is David Nutt. And David, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's good to be on this panel and talking about psychedelics as I see them as the future of many treatments, and diagnoses in psychiatry. So I am a psychiatrist, and I used to run a clinic for treatment-resistant depression, and I'm very conscious of the challenges that presents both to patients, to families, and to society. But I didn't start working with psychedelics with the intention of using them to treat depression. Like Harriet, I'm a psychopharmacologist, and I was just interested in what the psychedelic state was. And 20 years ago now, we began to use modern neuroimaging to ask the question, what goes on during a trip? And what goes on during a trip is something really very profound in terms of the subjective experience, but also very profound in terms of the physiological changes, which you can measure with fMRI, you can measure with EEG, you can measure with PET, etc. And it was those changes which showed to me, or at least gave me the insight that these drugs might be useful in depression, because one of the areas that was profoundly and directly affected by psilocybin in our first studies was a node in the front of the brain, which we know is overactive in depression, and psilocybin switched it off. And by that time, in 2012, there will be many other studies showing that different treatments of depression, whether they're psychological or physical, also switched off that node. But they would take weeks or months to do it, whereas we could do it within a few minutes. And that was why we began to conduct the first studies in depression. And the results were remarkable. People who had failed on up to 10 treatments had significant, often immediate benefits. And some of them have stayed well for many, many years. In the majority of cases, over time, the depressions crept back. But there was no doubt that a single psychedelic trip with psilocybin is probably the most profound single administration of any treatment in resistant depression. And as some of you will know, that has led to a large number of companies being set up to develop psilocybin, analogs of psilocybin, other psychedelics like LSD, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, as treatments for depression, and also addiction, and also OCD and anorexia, because these are all disorders in which the brain gets locked into thought processes. People get stuck in ruminative loops of thinking, which are very destructive, from which they can't escape. And psychedelics during the trip allow the brain to kind of reset. It is like, many of the patients describe it. They say, it is like you have reprogrammed my brain, reformatted my hard disk. You've run a virus scan. My brain works more normally now. And remarkably, the brain imaging studies we've done, certainly after psilocybin, in depressed people, show that their brain is more flexible. It is more functional. The imaging gives us a really rather remarkable correlation with the subjective benefits. So we have a scientifically based a base, at least, to which to believe that the therapy is actually doing something to the brain. It isn't just some expectation or some desire in patients to get better.
Thank you, David. Tiffany?
Hi there. So I'm Tiffany Farshoni. I am the director of the Division of Psychiatry in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration. So I have a slightly different perspective on the issue than some of the other panelists. I'm not actually involved in conducting research in psychedelics myself, but the vast majority of drug development programs for psychedelic products are they're regulated by my division. We review the clinical studies to make sure that they're safe to proceed. We review the study designs. The guidance on how to conduct studies with psychedelics was written by me and my colleagues in my division. So there are other divisions who are receiving applications. For instance, our Division of Anesthesiology, Addiction, and Pain. They are obviously getting any of the protocols for studies looking at addiction. We've got a few protocols coming into one of our neurology divisions looking at traumatic brain injury. But the vast majority of the psychedelic programs are reviewed by my division. And I have to say that they're keeping us very busy. For for folks who aren't aware of really the recent it's not just an interest from the public, it's an interest from academia and from commercial drug sponsors as well. It is fully a third of my workload at this point, just reviewing psychedelic INDs, whether it's for depression, PTSD, anxiety, whether we're talking about psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, any of them, they all come to me. So like I was saying, our main responsibility. So let me back up a second. So in drug development, we have two main types of applications. There is the investigational new drug, which is the IND, and that's when a product is still being studied. Then when all of the clinical studies are done, we get the NDA, which is the new drug application. At the IND stage, we're primarily interested in safety. We're looking to make sure that the drug is safe, the dose is safe, that all of the non-clinical studies to support safety monitoring have been done prior to giving the drug to humans. That we have consistent monitoring for the safety of the subjects when they are in that impaired state while they are actively undergoing treatment with psychedelics. All of these things are, part of our regulatory oversight. Once all of the clinical studies are done and we get a new drug application, that's where these programs are ultimately headed, so that something can be available and marketed, and that can be more. Folks won't have to go on a retreat in another country in order to receive these medications once they get to that state. but we're not there yet. We've had one application, and I think, folks know what happened with the MDMA application. But there are so many that are in development. There are some that are very close to coming in with their marketing applications. So it's a really exciting time in terms of psychedelic drug development. But we do need to make sure that that we hold these programs to the same standard that every other drug development program is held to. The same standards of evidence, the same standards of patient safety, the same standards of evaluation. It is challenging because in some ways it feels like fitting a square peg into a round hole, mainly because, well, two reasons. One, because it's like, let's face it, it's nearly impossible to blind these studies. There is the effects are so profound that people know when they've received the drug. And then there's, the issues of expectation bias and all of those things that need to be somehow either managed or accounted for statistically. So it's challenging. I lost my train of thought as far as what I was going to say for the other thing. But in any case, I think that's probably enough for an introduction. I know we've got from the questions that were posed. I think that we'll get to a lot of the other issues coming up. But I did see that Dr. Volkow has joined us, so perhaps it's a good time, Mark, to pass it over to her.
Yep. So Nora, I've already made your apologies, and please tell the group about you and why you're here today.
Yes, Mark, and thanks for bringing us together and organizing this panel. And again, I apologize. This is what happens when people don't realize that there are 3-hour difference between California and Maryland, New York. And so that led to the mess up. But I think it's I know I'm in a disadvantage because I did not hear what the prior panelists were saying. But what I can tell you is that for us, I think from the perspective of science, which is what I basically represent, and by the way, I'm Nora Volkow, director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and the function of the National Institute of Drug Abuse is to do everything that we can to advance science and knowledge in ways that can help actually prevent and treat addiction, and in the process, actually improve the life of populations and individuals. So in this context, what can I say about psychedelic drugs from the scientific perspective? And what I can say is that they are truly game changers. And I'm fascinated by them. Why do I say that they are game changers? They are game changers from the perspective of pharmacology and how we understand drugs. So, for example, in the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, we use stimulant medications like Ritalin or amphetamine. And you know that the effects are actually happening when that drug is on board, when the person is under the effects of the drug. Once the drug basically leaves their brain and body, no longer it has effects. And in other types of drugs like antipsychotics or antidepressants, you need the presence of the drug. Even though it is actually has cumulative effects, you still need the presence of the drug. And if the person stops taking the drug, they will basically relapse. So what these medications are doing is shifting the paradigm because it is actually providing us a tool that enables us to modify the neurobiology, neurochemistry of specific synapses and circuits that relate to the conditions in which you are actually given that drug. Extremely sensitive to the context at which the drug is given, and extremely sensitive to the expectations that the person brings into what this drug is going to actually produce from them. And this is extraordinary because we know, and researchers are trying to, of course, understand how this happens. And this has led to the recognition that a single administration of a psychedelic drug, the typical ones like LSD or psilocybin, can actually produce strengthen synapses and actually create new synapses in the brain in specific areas and circuits that are being stimulated when you are getting the drug, but also in areas that are being promoted synaptic formation even without that stimulation. So we know this from imaging studies in animals, where you can see that with one dose of psychedelic, the density of synapses and dendrites has expanded considerably. And with neuroimaging in humans, we can start to see indeed a strengthening of functional connections after a single administration that persists weeks, even months after their administration. And that's why I call from the pharmacology. And this is a game changer. It's also a game changer from the perspective of clinical trials, and I suspect that this has already been touched upon because it's much more complex. I mean, we always want to have, in a randomized clinical trial, a control condition. And this is extraordinary difficult to do with psychedelic drugs. And so it's challenging all of us to think in ways that we can accomplish it. And some propose you giving very low doses, others propose giving other drugs, and others basically embrace it and says, well, we maybe have to recognize that we cannot do a placebo like we do for other conditions. But in my brain, when I have challenging situations, I take the opportunity to actually try to move it around and say, let's look at it from a different perspective. And I'm going to throw it at all of you because this is actually what I think these drugs are giving to all of us, forcing us to think differently. So yes, the effects of psychedelic drugs are context dependent, very much going to be determined by the setup. And this is clearly identified as important in clinical trials. So the setup is someone is coming with the expectation that these drugs are going to help them. And these drugs are going to have neuroplastic effects. And we know that that happens in an animal, even though they don't have a placebo effect. And it happens even when they are anesthetized. So what does this mean? That if you are having this expectation of having a placebo effect, could it be that the neuroplasticity triggered by the psychedelic drug could enhance the duration of that placebo effect? I mean, this is speculative in my brain, but I'm just throwing it at you because I think that this could give us, again, a paradigm where we're using psychedelic drugs to possibly maximize the effect of a placebo. So placebo are short-lasting in general. And imagine if we could do that, if we could actually enhance the duration of that effect. So that is an example of how game-changing these drugs are to us. And a third one that I want just to comment about why this is so incredibly fascinating. As researchers are starting to investigate with neuroimaging in humans, what happens to the function of the human brain? What appears to be shown during the state of intoxication, I'm not speaking now about the long-lasting effect, but the state of intoxication. What happens is the architecture and configuration of the brain gets modified in such a way that patterns of responses that are automatic actually no longer basically dominate the way that you perceive the world. And if you think about it in many ways, this is actually what people are reporting also in a way is like being born again, but with as an adult, where your brain is configured in a way that it was when you were first born. And the interactions between the different brain networks actually, not surprising, get modified. So I think that I'm telling you all of these things because you can realize that from the scientific perspective, studying psychedelic drugs give us an opportunity, not just with potential therapeutics that need to be documented and for which evidence is necessary, but importantly, to advance our understanding of the nervous system and to advance our understanding of the neurobiology of our human brains and our consciousness. This ends my introductory remarks, and I pass it back to you, Mark.
So thank you, Nora. And what you brought up is something that I would love to hear a comment on from Harriet and David. As many of us have seen that cartoon, I don't know if it was a New Yorker cartoon, but it's of four naked people dancing around the room while four are sitting on their hands saying, I guess we're in the control group. And I mean, in our own studies using neural and glial cells, I can use serotonergic agonists that are not psychedelic or other inactive compounds as a control, and the cells don't know the difference. But your subjects do. So I'd love to hear comments on that. And how are we going to, if we need to get around it, how do we do that?
I'll just make a very brief comment and then pass it on to David. I would just like to reinforce what Nora says about understanding the brain. I think a really important parallel purpose of the research that we do is to understand how the brain is organized, how emotions are organized, how experiences change behavior, and how we set memories. And we can't move on in developing drugs or treatments without understanding basic brain function. So I would say that's a parallel motivation and goal in doing this research on these remarkable drugs that make phenomenal changes in people's behavior. So I just want to reinforce what she said. And David, please take it from there.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's we're approaching it exactly the wrong way. The idea that something as profound as a psychedelic should be subjected to the traditional approach which we have used for the last 50 years of giving drugs which are you give every day, which have side effects which can be problematic, using scales which have really are rather old and certainly not have ever been used for something as profound as a psychedelic, is as Tiffany said, we are trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and we have to think about it differently. I certainly endorse what Nora was saying. I think a significant aspect of recovery from placebo is the desire to get better, and there is certainly imaging evidence that the placebo response is mediated through similar circuits to the circuits which mediate therapeutic responses. And psychedelics certainly will do that more powerfully. But the idea that we might perceive them as not being effective simply because people know they're getting a treatment, I think that's problematic for two reasons. The first is I think it's insulting to our patients. I don't know of any patient with severe depression that didn't want to get better. And I know most of mine have had multiple treatments. They started off with amitriptyline, and then they went on SSRIs, and they went on Wellbutrin, and then they've gone on vortioxetine. They've been on every new treatment that's come along, and they've always wanted to get better on that treatment. And they haven't. And the idea that because you give them something that they know they're on, when it will somehow be better than the ones that they knew they were on before, I just think is insulting. I just don't think that really fits with the mindset and the problem of chronic depression. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think we should worry about it. I mean, we know, well, I don't know, but I suspect in your country, like in my country, you don't do randomized controlled trials on surgery for knee replacements or hip replacements. You do surgery and you optimize the surgery and you monitor outcomes in relation to the intervention, the need for medication, pain control, and then the recovery afterwards. So basically, this kind of therapy is so different. We should see it much more like surgery, much less like what we've always done. And we shouldn't try to fit it into that paradigm. We should actually develop a new paradigm of assessing outcomes, which is much more real-world evidence, much more monitoring before and after, trial designs which don't rely simply on RCT evidence, because, as we've pointed out, that's going to be very, very difficult to blind. And I would say one final thing. We have looked at expectancy. We have done the only controlled trial of psilocybin, 2 doses, versus escitalopram, 6 weeks treatment. And that showed very clearly that expectation had 0 impact on the psilocybin response. It actually, interestingly, did predict the escitalopram response. So we shouldn't be applying false beliefs to psychedelics in the way some people are, because it's, I think, is demeaning to our patients, it's stigmatizing, and it's not right.
So I was going to pass it on to the FDA. So the question is, how do they decide then what's an effective treatment versus a placebo?
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
the
and I think
question.
that's actually I was going to jump in there because I think a lot of the the speculation about why something works or what's going on in the brain, that's never been a requirement for approval. I mean, if we needed to understand why a drug produces the effect that it does in psychiatry, we wouldn't have anything. We like SSRIs, we know that they, work on serotonin, but what happens downstream that leads from the effect on the serotonin system to the improvement in your mood? I mean, pathophysiology is a bit of a black box. No FDA pun intended there. But I think that one of the ways that we have suggested that we can get the reliable information that we need in order to make a decision about a drug, because our regulatory standard is that we require data from adequate and well-controlled studies that are defined in the Code of Federal Regulations and all this stuff. We need positive studies, blah, blah, blah. If a placebo-controlled study, if folks look at it and say, well, of course, the folks who know they got the drug are going to get better. Well, okay, how do we get around that? How do we supplement that data to make it more reliable? And one of the things that we've suggested is like, okay, well, maybe you could consider also doing a study without a placebo and looking at a couple of different doses. And if you see a clear dose response relationship, that also will contribute to to the ability to rely on that data, to think that, okay, well, now from two different sources, two different study designs, we're seeing consistent results. That is that's something that we've outlined in our psychedelic guidance as one way to sort of manage this problem that we're dealing with in terms of placebo-controlled trial designs and what we do with them. Because the expectation is there, the bias is there, the unblinding is there. Okay, but is that going to account for the magnitude of improvement that you see in those studies? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, they're impressive studies. But if you now see in a dose response relationship, that gives you more confidence in the result, that you are seeing a true effect, and it's something that is drug related, because at a higher dose you see a greater improvement. So that's one way that we have suggested that folks can provide that substantial evidence to us in order to get to a drug approval.
I've been going over the questions, and I'd like to paraphrase one of them to all of our panelists. And Nora has heard me say this before. The way I would paraphrase the question is 2A or not 2A? That is the question. So what do you think? I mean, some of our preclinical results suggest that it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I would jump. I mean, I clearly see this like any field this is not a novel field, but it was silenced for many, many years. And I guess since it was silenced, we have tools and now new findings that actually are telling us we cannot ignore it anymore. And so, but at the same time, what's happening is people are jumping too fast into claims that if they are not consolidated, my fear is they could actually come back to bite us, because it could result in negating the opportunity that we have to explore these compounds. So my perspective on all of this is let's learn what from the mistakes of the way that some of these studies were done in the past, so that we can maximize the potential of them eventually getting into approved therapeutic purposes. I do realize that overall they are already like the certain things for which you don't need the randomized clinical trials, or for which you actually can give an intervention without having it approved by the FDA. But an aspect that is important is the FDA approval facilitates its reimbursement. So if we want to make these treatments accessible to everyone, to do A or not to A, having FDA approval will actually increase the likelihood that these treatments will be reimbursed and made accessible to others. So that is another issue of consideration. And I throw it back at you, Mark.
Harriet or David, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think we know quite clearly that the psychedelic trip is a two-way mediated effect. The neuroplasticity is much more complicated, and that is almost certainly got a two-way component. So for the audience who don't know what we're talking about, this is a clever pun. Psychedelics target the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of the 15 serotonin receptor subtypes. And if you block that, you don't have a trip. But on the other hand, you can block that and still have some effects on the brain. So some of the neuroplasticity, the synaptic growth that Nora mentioned, can be seen even if you don't have the trip, or at least in animals you can see if you block the effects. And that's maybe mediated through a different part of the 2A receptor or through some other receptors, or it's likely to be a combination of, I think, several different factors.
Okay, so now there's another question about one of the issues with depression is that so many people who suffer from depression also suffer from the stigma of depression and unwillingness to treat. And in the film In Waves and War, one of the really tough former Navy SEALs makes it very clear that he is unwilling, well, either to engage in the hippie stuff of psychedelics or just even to get serious treatment for his depression. Do you see that psychedelics may be useful in helping to break down some of those barriers?
Well, I'm going to say that I'm very impressed with Oregon and now Colorado. So the great thing about your US state system is that states can do interesting things which the government can't do, and certainly not my government won't do. So the Oregon experiment with allowing mushroom source psilocybin for well-being is a really interesting experiment, because I think it will begin to destigmatize and reduce the fear that's been inculcated in the population for the last 50 years that these drugs are dangerous and not useful. So I'm very hopeful that you are beginning to change the direction of the sort of narrative about these drugs through those kind of statewide initiatives.
Yeah, and I will second that, because I think that the best way of abolishing stigma and fear is by providing evidence that this treatment works. And I think that that would help not just for the acceptance of psychedelics as an antidepressant, if it turns out that that is the case, but also for patients to feel more comfortable to speak about depression and to seek help. So I do think it would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also say the movement of psychedelic drugs back into mainstream psychiatry in very prestigious medical centers will help with its public image, that it would be more acceptable. And at the same time, groups like the group that Marcus is working with, they're very actively publicizing the benefits and the risks and to the population that we might not reach in the academic community. So I think parallel efforts from both the medical community and from the actual victims and users are really a step forward. And honestly, I think the field is doing the right thing right now by conducting a lot of studies under a lot of different conditions with different samples and different drug doses and different combinations, that's going to be the only way to move forward, to see the empirical evidence that under what circumstances a drug works and under what circumstances they don't work. We want to know what they don't work for and who they don't work for, because we haven't heard very much about that. The people who are positive are saying they work for everything, but we also need to find out what the limitations are. So I think as a field, we're doing the right thing right now by encouraging and promoting the research carefully, of course, to not go overboard in the way maybe they did over in the 70s. But I think that we're on the right track at this point.
But the one problem, Harriet, is that the schedule status makes the research 10 times more expensive, effectively. For me, maybe not for you, but almost certainly the scheduling is very limiting. It's a burden we don't need. And I think if there are ways of reducing that burden, we do a lot more research.
Bravo, David. Yes.
I agree. I agree, but we also have to have a way to minimize risks. We don't want to do the experiment on the whole population and find out that the drugs are risky for some subset. The FDA can speak better to this, but I appreciate that we have to have some sort of a filter on making the drug available to everybody. I mean, you mentioned Oregon and Colorado. We'll have to see what happens there and whether they really are making it available to everybody, and then what bad effects there might be.
But Harriet, the scheduling makes it unavailable to researchers as well.
That's a problem. That's actually a big problem. It is actually not that we're not going to do rigorous studies. This is independent. Is that the scheduling makes it extraordinarily complex to do research with it. And also, if you take it at face value, there's no evidence that certainly for the classical psychedelic that they produce addiction. So that concern is not even relevant here. So I don't understand why this scheduling on one. I suspect, and I guess I'm an optimist, that hopefully this will be revision, but I do not know. I let the FDA speak for that, but
Well, if we ultimately do approve something and say that it, and endorse it and say it has a therapeutic use, then it will no longer be Schedule 1. I don't know what schedule it will end up in, through the review process, because, ultimately that's up to, we make our recommendations, 8-factor analysis, all that stuff. The DEA is the one that ultimately makes the decision. But,
And our experience is that it's an after you, Alphonse situation between the FDA and the DEA. Someone has to go through. After you, Alphonse, someone has to make the first step. We got about a minute left. Marcus, do you have any concluding remarks?
No, I find this conversation fascinating. I feel like we can go a couple hours, and I don't want to call it argument, but there's definitely, I think we're all trying to get to the same place. I think we all feel it's different how we're supposed to get there. I'm on the wagon of we do need to think about affordable access. I subsidize payments for veterans through vets. Tar Mind is trying to do that through employee benefits. We're talking about state-funded programs right now that I think forgot about how do we pay for like the person that's on Medicaid for a treatment. So that's why I'm, fully pushing FDA approval for these, because I believe that, we need commercial payers and Medicare, Medicaid to come.
Well, that hour sure went by quickly, didn't it? And I'm really sorry that we haven't had the time to answer the questions that so many of you thoughtfully gave us. We will do that, and each one of you who has asked a question will be responded to directly. So I want you to know that. And I just want to really thank both the audience for being here and your interest, and all of our speakers who came together to make what I thought was an extraordinary panel and a really exciting time. And I think we should be doing this again in the near future. So thanks all for being here, and thank you to all of our wonderful speakers, and everyone be well.